Music has taken some strange turns over the years, and in fact, some people find it very difficult to keep up. It's hard to get an historical perspective. We look back on music through the decades, and we see styles changing. We look into the Middle Ages, and even farther, beyond antiquity. But perhaps this is a little too far back. Let's stop at the Roman Empire. This is the Roman Empire, pretty much at its height, surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean, incidentally, is from a Latin word meaning middle of the lands, or middle of the earth, because it's a great inland sea. There was, of course, music at this time, too. Not too much of it survives, because it wasn't written down, but we know from pictures and writings, and just from the basics of human nature, that people tried to entertain each other with music. Now, we know a lot about the Roman Empire. We know a lot less about the people who lived to the north. These people were called by the Greeks and the Romans barbarians. The generally accepted etymology of the word barbarians, believe it or not, is that it's a sort of a twisted imitation, that the Greeks thought that the people who couldn't speak Greek simply said bar 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 bar, and they became barbarians, much like the Russian word for German, Niemiecki, means people who can't speak, because they can't speak Russian. The Germanic peoples, of course, had music too, but they didn't write it down either, so we really don't know much about it, though we know they had poems that survived, sometimes long epic poems, which were probably sung. The centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire, when the balance of power had clearly shifted away from Rome, are generally called the Dark Ages, but for the peoples up north, it was also called the Heroic Age, the time when the heroes of these epic poems were out doing their things. And we can sometimes tell that a poem is from the Heroic Age because there's occasionally a historical reference, and we can say, ah yes, some version of that poem was being sung at that time. And this Heroic Age ended pretty much when the Germanic peoples decided to settle down, and their desire to keep moving in the Great Migrations had pretty much ebbed. This was the time of the Vikings, and also of the Vandals, and of the Goths. This here is a Goth, not to be confused with later Goths, and we think that the Goths originally lived up here in southern Denmark. The Germanic peoples are usually seen as very warlike. Whether they were or not is hard to say, because we usually get our juiciest history from accounts of wars and so forth, so they may have been a gentle and sweet and contented people who occasionally participated in raids against the empire. It's hard to know. In truth, they might have been a subtle combination of both of these characteristics. And of course the Romans had little to brag about themselves, because their empire was constantly expanding under various armies and generals into areas, north, east, west, and south, that were not Roman at all, and they usually expanded without the permission of the people who were already there. Anyway, for some reason, also not known, possibly because of the climate, the Goths were unhappy in their original homeland, and they moved to warmer climes, down here, by the Black Sea, and they lived on the shores of the Black Sea for a while, and things were going relatively well for them, as you can see. But then these marauding Goths, or non-marauding Goths, saw something on the horizon that terrified even them, an invasion from the east, an invasion by a group of people who were unknown to them, but whose leader they nicknamed Little Daddy, which in the Gothic language was Attila. Attila was, of course, the ruler of the Huns. Well, the appearance of this group of people made the Goths very concerned, and so they decided to stay one step ahead of the Huns wherever possible. They eventually found themselves on the border of the empire, asking very politely to be let in. At that point in time, the Roman Empire was divided into two sections. There was an Eastern and a Western Empire. The Eastern Emperor, down in Constantinople, was a fellow by the name of Valens. Valens thought that letting the Goths into the empire would be a pretty neat idea, because they might make good soldiers in the Roman army. The Goths' attitude was pretty much whatever you want, and they were allowed to cross the frontier. But things weren't very good for the Goths once they crossed into the empire, and they were treated very much like second-class citizens. This went on for a while until the Goths did some thinking and realized that they could easily change professions and go from refugees to looters, which was a role they were a little more comfortable with. Oh, incidentally, the Goths by now had long since separated into two groups, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, and it's pretty much the Visigoths who are going to receive more attention here. So the Goths, the Visigoths, under the leadership of General Alaric, headed down to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, which they didn't succeed in taking, but they did sack areas of Greece, and after that they decided to go after Rome in the Western Empire. Now there were two established Roman governments, but the actual status of the empire was still very confusing. There were Romans who were on the, quote, barbarian side, and, quote, barbarians who were on the Roman side. There were opportunists everywhere, and very often you had people changing sides just as often as there are days with vowels in them. Despite all these uncertainties, however, a barbarian contingency headed toward Rome with the intention of sacking and looting the city and getting very rich. Well, the Western emperor at the time, Honorius, was actually a young boy, and though he had lots and lots of military advice from his general Stilicho, he couldn't really be expected to have the experience one needs to deal with such a huge problem. But he did decide it might be a very good idea to increase the defenses of Rome, so he called in a lot of soldiers from the outlying areas of the empire. But it didn't really work because Rome was sacked anyway. But what was significant for this story is that Roman soldiers were withdrawn from the island colony of Britannia. The Roman presence, which had existed there for a very long time, was no longer present, and so the Celts and the Picts, who had been there for a very, very, very long time, went back to beating the hell out of one another, and things on the island became rather unpleasant. Well, that was until a king named VORTIGERN decided to improve his lot and the lot of his people in his little kingdom, which was called Kent. VORTIGERN had had quite enough of his people being terrorized left and right, and he hit upon an idea. He had heard about the Germanic tribes across the sea, how they were very good fighters, and he decided to invite them over to Britain to help protect him against all the other Celts and Picts who were invading and marauding. He sent emissaries across the North Sea and told people how nifty things were in Kent, and promised any takers a nice little parcel of land if they would help defend Kent against the enemy. Well, this offer eventually attracted the attention of two brothers, Hengist and Horsa. Hengist and Horsa, if they really existed, which is doubtful, were the adventurous types, and they decided to cross the North Sea to Kent, and they did indeed help VORTIGERN defeat some of the other Celts, and they were given their little parcel of land. This was supposedly in the year 449. But Hengist and Horsa were not content to be servants of a king, and so they eventually rose up and killed their liege lord VORTIGERN, and assumed the leadership role of Kent themselves, creating the very first Germanic kingdom on the island. Incidentally, if the Hengist and Horsa story is true, then as soon as either one of them set foot on the island, he became the very first speaker of a language called English, because their language was very similar to that of the Goths, who were referred to many minutes ago now. And what made this North Sea language English was the fact that it was a Germanic language and had been brought from the northern coast of Europe and was now being spoken on the island of Britain. And you can see some of the similarities. Well, word got around that the Celts were very easy to defeat, so more and more people from Germanic tribes began to pour onto the island. These were traditionally people from three tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, or the Utes. That is correct, I said Utes. And many of the Saxons settled down here and created kingdoms like Sussex, home of the South Saxons, Wessex, home of the West Saxons, and Essex, home of the East Saxons. However, over time, most of the southern half of the island, that is, south of Scotland, became known as the land of the Angles instead of the land of the Saxons, with the name Englaland, later England. Of course, there was still the Celtic problem. The Celts were still there. But after a while, at least in the southern and eastern parts of the island, they had been completely subjugated by the English. So the Celts had three choices. 1, they could fight back, which wasn't always very successful. 2, they could try to become English, which many of them did, though not necessarily right away, but over time. Or 3, they could hightail it out of there and go farther north or west or somewhere else. Incidentally, in another bit of unfair name-giving, the Germanic tribes now began to refer to the Celts as foreigners, even though the Celts were there long before, and in Old English this word for foreigners was Welsh. So you had the English, who were of Germanic origin, and the Welsh, who were everyone else, except of course the Picts, who were way in the north, but no one really knows much about them, and yes, it's a little unfair to dismiss them because of this reason. Some of these Celts, or Welsh, had even had enough of the island, and so they took off for what is now northwestern France and settled in this area, and because they were from the island of Britannia, this area became known as Brittany, and their language became known as Breton, which endured even though it had very stiff competition from the French language, competition which is even stronger today, but the culture throve and flourished for many years, and there was Breton literature and Breton food and all of the things one associates with culture, resulting in a certain amount of admiration by other nations, and eventually a lot of girls being named after this place, including notable singers whose effect on music in the scope of history has yet to be determined.